to this week's lecture on the Book of Job for our week on wisdom literature. The illustrations I'll be using this week are from the Book of Job illustrated by William Blake, who lived, I think these were come from about 1826, and he made a 22 engraved prints on this subject. So a little bit of background. Job is, as you can tell from your readings and from its placement in our class, part of wisdom literature, along with Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and the Wisdom of Solomon. All of these are about our search for how to master life, how to understand how humans should behave before God, and also are interested in sort of universal human experiences that affect all people. They are part of the ancient Near Eastern wisdom literature, as you read. All of these belong to an international movement of ancient Near Eastern wisdom literature. And as you'll see in Job, there are no Israelite characters in the text. They are all, however, monotheists. There's no history of Israel included. Other Mesopotamian and Egyptian literature is similar to this. For instance, we have a text called the Babylonian Job from the Kassite period that has a very similar story, and another in Ugaritic called the Righteous Sufferer, which is similar as well. Other historians have also called it lament literature, as we find lament literature in the Psalms. Chapter 3 in particular in Job is lament literature, but not all of it is laments. There's also dialogue, as you'll see. Like Ecclesiastes, Job can also be categorized as skeptical literature, which is a subsection of wisdom literature, where it questions the role of justice and the doctrine of retribution. This is also found in other Middle Eastern wisdom literature that is also skeptical or pessimistic. Job is one of the most mysterious books in the Bible, and it resembles no other text in terms of its writing. Theologically, it's a radical challenge to the doctrine of reward for righteousness and punishment for the wicked. Yet, we know that early on, it was accepted as a sacred text. It is found in the Dead Sea Scrolls as part of the canon of sacred texts. Job deals with the issue of theodicy, which is an important vocabulary word for here, which is the justification for why, if God is good, bad things happen to good people. It used to be believed that it was written during the First Temple period. We know that it is mentioned, Job himself is mentioned in Ezekiel 14:14 as one of the righteous men saved from disaster. And this shows us that the character of Job probably existed in earlier folk traditions. It uses Aramaic language within the text, which teaches us something about it. The poetry borrows a lot of terms from the Aramaic. So this suggests a time in which Aramaic was in the process of beginning to replace Hebrew as the vernacular. So most historians say it comes from around the 6th or 5th century BCE. Now, the structure of the text. The frame story is a folklore story. It's probably a story that existed long before the other parts, right? So chapters 1 and 2 are scenes that are set with the old folk tale of how God tests Job, who is faithful in every case, and the frame story returns at the end in chapter 42. In between, we have, as I said, Job's lamentation in that chapter 3, and then the majority of a text is a rounds of debates with his friends. We have 3 rounds of debates, chapters 4 through 31, dialogue 1, dialogue 2, and dialogue 3, as you can see. We have a sort of an interlude in chapter 28, which is the Hymn of Wisdom. And it's sort of an interpretation, sort of confusing. It's not really, doesn't really fit with the text. It's a poem that expresses a pious view of wisdom as fear of the Lord. It's put in the mouth of Job, but it really sounds like it's God speaking it. We also have some fragmented text in chapters 25 through 26 that people believe have been, sort of mushed in there and are not really where they belong. We have Elihu's speech, chapters 32 through 37. This is interesting because this is a fourth friend of Job who appears. He's never mentioned in the frame story, and the poetry here is inferior to that written in the rest of the text by the Job poet. It seems to have been added later. Elihu challenges the friends and Job and demands that they submit to divine majesty and control over human events. He sees suffering as teaching one greater trust in God, right? So finally, after all of this, we have God's response, which we believe may have been meant to come right after the dialogues, but is cut by Elihu's speech. And we end again with the frame story. All right, so the folk tale. The old folk tale parts, as you will see, are very different than the rest of the story. There's a discussion of the council of gods or the son of gods that is part of Canaanite mythology. And the folk tale is really a pretext. It's a narrative excuse to introduce the real text. The council here is pre-monotheistic, right? God is having a council with others. But we also find this council of God in Psalm 82. So there's other examples of it. It's not an ethical monotheism, as God accepts to cause pain to Job for no other reason than a wager which he makes with Satan, who is one of the sons of God. First, he takes away everything from him, as you will see, and then he strikes him personally and physically. The word Satan in the Hebrew Bible usually refers to an accuser and an adversary, either earthly or heavenly. But here, Satan seems to be some kind of angelic being, one of the sons of God, although evidently he has a special status, and that's Satan there in the middle of the image with the fire around him. There's an assumed doctrine of retribution. Job is going to get his stuff back at the end. The framework also has a very pious Job who refuses to rail against God, as opposed to the rest of the dialogue, where Job is sometimes skeptical and sometimes denounces God. Job's lamentation, we find a similar lamentation in Psalm 22, which begins, my God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from saving me, so far from my cries of anguish? Chapter 3, as I said, in Job is the lamentation. It's the lot of language of the body, but some scholars see a combination between the two of them, sort of something is they are speaking to each other. Then we have the debates. As I said, most of the text is the debates. Here's Job and his three friends accusing him. The debates is between the Job and his friends, and then at the end we have God's response. And these are interestingly three levels of poetry. The bottom level is seen in the language of reproof of his three friends. Their arguments are rather cliched, and their poetry is full of familiar formulations, as we would find in Psalms or Proverbs. But there are moments when the poetry sort of elevates itself, right? They argue that all suffering is caused by sin. We then have the poetry of Job, and the part of Job is much richer in terms of its pet metaphors, in terms of its parallelism, and it questions the theodicy of the friends. Some argued that, or continue to argue, that the three friends represent different theological or philosophical schools. Maimonides in the Middle Ages thought Job had the voice of Aristotle, while Eliphaz was the voice of the law. All punishment is deserved. Bildad is the opinion of Mutazila, which is that suffering gives you reward. And Zophar is the idea that everything is due to God's inscrutable will. While Elihu, Maimonides says, is his own opinion. So those are sort of different ways people have tried to theologically justify these different arguments. So finally, we will get to God's response. Oh, sorry. There we go. God's response. This is the third level of poetry in which God talks from the whirlwind. We see a great interest in nature here, as found in Job's own speeches, right? And God's challenge may not be an answer to suffering, as you will see, but it's a comprehensive overview of the nature of reality. And it exposes that Job is coming from a human perspective, that he has restricted knowledge, and that he has the egoism of suffering, as we all become more egotistical when we suffer. There are a couple of things to notice in the text of God's speech. There's the mention of Leviathan, who's a sea monster of Canaanite mythology, who had to be subdued by the weather god. And we see God reciting the powers and marvels which he has created, which are beyond human understanding. And so this is the two kinds of theodicy could be seen within God's response. We have educative theodicy, which is this idea that suffering is a text that promotes spiritual growth, which is what we find in the Friends. Also deferred theodicy, which is that humanity is not the center of God's cosmos necessarily. And this is what we find more of in God's responses, this deferred theodicy. This idea that we can't understand God fully, that we need to decenter ourselves. God's standards of justice are different than ours, perhaps. We find these in Ecclesiastes also, as Ecclesiastes goes so far as to say that God may not be just. So the question of justice comes up here in God's response and is not fully answered. All right, reception of the text. One of the things I find fascinating with Job, and I hope you will too, is how often Job has been taken up by modern authors and used as a template to ask these questions of theodicy. So in the Middle Ages, obviously, we have Gregory the Great in the 7th century, who sees Job as a tale of spiritual and moral progress, this idea that we are striving for perfection. Maimonides, who I already mentioned in the 12th century, who talks about the conflict between traditional religion with its emphasis on reward and punishment and the true wisdom of God's providence, which Job finally arrives at. We have Aquinas in the 13th century, who sees it as a question of divine care or guidance being the key message, and that divine wisdom is the source of order of all the world. And we have John Calvin, the Protestant reformer in the 16th century, who argues that we need to trust God even when the world is at its darkest and God is at his most silent. But we also have some great works of literature and film that revolve around Job. And I would just ask that hopefully you can watch or read one of these. The Tree of Life by Lawrence Malik is a meditation upon the book of Job. Cormac McCarthy's book, The Road is also such a meditation. Bruce Almighty, which is a comedy, also uses Job. One of my favorites that is the most aligned with Job, that is really truly a meditation on Job, is a Danish film called Adam's Apple, which I really recommend. So today's reflection and what you will be thinking about is theodicy.